Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you here in RIAC, and today we have an extremely interesting webinar. We run it in a close partnership with Valdai Discussion Club, and we have an occasion. Our occasion is a publication of the Valdai analytical paper, which was published, issued yesterday on the website of Valdai Discussion Club. On New Atlanticism, and we have here today the author of this paper, Professor Richard Sakwa from University of Kent. And let me also introduce our colleagues from Valdai Discussion Club. Mr. Fedor Lukyanov is the head of Scientific Council of Valdai Club. He is also chief editor of Russian Global Policy,
Global Affairs.
Russian Global Affairs journal, and Professor Oleg Barabanov is a professor of YIM University, and in Valdai Club he runs a program on alternative ideologies and doctrines. So correct me, Oleg, if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's true. It's about global alternatives to the liberal capitalist mainstream.
To the Atlanticism.
And to the Atlanticism as a part of the liberal mainstream.
And let me introduce myself. I am Ivan Timofeyev. I'm a director of programs here in Russian International Affairs Council, and I also work in Valdai Club as the head of the program on contemporary state. I propose to start to start our discussion, and my first question to Richard on his paper, actually, it stands very provocative and interesting questions, and one of them is a question on the prospects of NATO. So you are writing about the new doctrine, new Atlantism, as something, a fresh stream in let's say, NATO ideological origins. My question is whether this new idea makes NATO strategically competitive, more competitive, or less competitive. And of course, taking into account NATO relations with Russia, do current relations, which are often described in terms of deterrence, containment, and mutual fear, security dilemma, etc., do they promote the development of NATO and global competitiveness of NATO, or they block NATO strategically? So that's my question, and you're also welcome to highlight the key points of your paper. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the focus obviously nowadays is, what is the role and purpose and meaning of NATO in contemporary international politics? And to answer your fundamentally important question, I'd like to go back one step and to say that this Atlanticism of which we're talking about is a peculiar phenomenon which we can give it a precise date of beginning, August 1941, when Churchill met Roosevelt off Newfoundland. And this was at a time when, before the United States had joined the Second World War, and of course it was only after December 1941 and the Japanese attack that it actually joined. But Churchill was desperate to get support and to get material. But they couldn't talk about the war because the United States was not in a war at that stage. But what they talked about was values, norms, and so on. And this gave birth to the Atlantic Charter. Now, the Atlantic Charter still lies at the basis of the politics and understanding of NATO, and indeed, it's one of those pillars of the post-Cold War security order. Now, and the point about this is that Atlanticism itself is often misunderstood. It's not just about the military strategy of NATO and so on. It's embedded, deeply embedded, in this whole normative idea that, in other words, that security can only be achieved by changing the nature of the regimes. So it was a revolutionary doctrine, even, if you like, the Atlantic Charter. It really challenged the very fundamental basis of what was balanced later on by the Yalta tradition of the post-Second World War system. So you had the Atlantic tendency, you had the Yalta tendency. Yalta was about sovereignty, it was about respect for geopolitical pluralism and ideological pluralism. Not that people particularly wanted it, but the mere fact that the Soviet Union and its vast military forces took the bulk of the effort in defeating Nazi Germany. And obviously, you had to deal with a powerful Soviet Union in 1945. Yalta was that very powerful moment. So this was the first phase. Then, of course, we had the beginning of the, within the framework of Yalta, of the Cold War, of these two tendencies, as it were, kept in balance. The Atlanticist, which involves not just security, but it involves systemic transformation. That security can be achieved by changing the very nature of your enemy. And of course, the enemy at that stage, of course, was Nazi Germany. But the implication, of course, was Soviet Russia, and later on, of course, Putinite Russia. So there's a tradition all the way on from there. This phase of Atlanticism lasted until the Malta, effectively, is symbolic. Malta in December 1989. Malta effectively repudiated both geopolitical pluralism and ideological diversity of the sort of work which Oleg is doing. So it's, and then we had, Malta was, if you like, a symbolic end of the Cold War. This is the moment in which Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev is talking about, a common European home. He was putting forward a vision, a very powerful vision of a continentalist vision. So you had a third element in all of this mix against the Atlanticism, which is very much an Anglo-Saxon dominated concept, if you like. So you had a third element which Gorbachev really thought would be the platform for a post-Cold War peace, where you'd have, at that stage, of course, in 1989, Gorbachev was still talking about the establishment of a humane democratic socialism. I'm still in favour of it myself. I'd love to say a humane and democratic socialism, but of course, that all collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed. So you actually had this continentalism, which we now call Greater Europe, the Большая Europa idea. But anyway, so we have this, then from 1989 until 2014, you had the second phase of Atlanticism. And this was an Atlanticism which was looking for purpose and meaning. Because obviously NATO, went out of area. It involved itself in the wars in Yugoslavia. It involved itself in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So, as they said, NATO needs to go out of area or it goes out of business, was the famous statement at that stage. I would now say that the second phase, this 25 years, I now call it the 25 years crisis. And obviously, I'm referring to E.H. Carr, the 20 years crisis of the interwar years. That is between 1918 and 1939. And the point was, as E.H. Carr would argue, that none of the fundamental security and other dilemmas were resolved in those 20 years between the wars. I've been arguing for a long time that the last 25 years, none of the fundamental security and even civilizational normative dilemmas facing Europe and indeed the world more widely have been resolved. This is the second phase where NATO was looking for its purpose. It became almost, we're talking about its transformation. It was, it never quite knew it. Why I'm now talking about a new Atlanticism, because I'm arguing we're entering a third phase. And this third phase from 2014 is the activation of NATO as a military alliance, and of course with its advanced, not permanent bases yet, as Duda is asking for it in Poland now, but a more active military neo-containment policy vis-a-vis Russia, the end of geopolitical pluralism on the continent, the end of ideological pluralism, of course, because the Atlantic Charter and its peculiar normative, transformative element, I call it trans-democracy, where security and democracy are merged together, undermining both security and democracy, by the way. This is the theme of my lecture at Renipa yesterday, was precisely trans-democracy and its implications. That is one of the foundations of this new Atlanticism, which is slightly going beyond the paper which came out yesterday. But, we're looking at it. I want to now just to make one slight modification. I'm arguing that we have the potential for a new Atlanticism. And as you rightly said, it is highly controversial, this idea, because you could say that, in fact, people would say, how can you talk about a new Atlanticism as a powerful new reinvigoration of this Atlantic Charter, this trans-democracy, and indeed of the security alliance of Atlanticism? I would argue that it is the context in which debates take place. So what I'm saying is that New Atlanticism is a very powerful agenda. I mean, Atlantic Council, I speak to these people all the time, a very militant vision of the shape of the way that European security and global politics should be shaped. There's a whole ideological offensive, a military offensive, re-energy, an attempt to rebuild the bloc politics within the framework of Atlanticism, and fourthly, the denial of continentalism. And there's a very important element which Oleg will obviously work on, is that Atlanticism has effectively subsumed within it the European Union. Yeah. That the European Union has lost its autonomy, strategic and political autonomy. Of course, those of us who work within the European Union know that it's a highly complex system. But in security terms, the European Union, because of Atlanticism, never developed. I mean, when I talk about continentalism, in particular about in the security element, I'm condemned, and the way it's condemned is what's called, they call it the Gaullist heresy. Actually, they use this word, the Gaullist heresy, as if this was a sin against the primal birth of Atlanticism. So it's really a extraordinary element. However, just my final point, I don't want to talk long, but just my final point is to say, yes, there are plenty of arguments against the notion of the New Atlantic. First of all, how many countries are actually contributing the 2% to the defence budgets? How much genuine coordination? We see that the bloc discipline is pretty weak within this framework, Hungary and many other maverick states. So I never deny it. In fact, you could say, in actual fact, of course, this revival of Atlanticism is provoking and is attended by numerous contradictions. And these contradictions, we never deny them. We simply say, yes, there are plenty of contradictions, but these contradictions are being framed within the framework of this revived Atlantic system. And indeed, I would argue that this New Atlanticism is a fundamentally, clearly we also have our normative biases, and I would argue, and I make no bones about it, that this is a mistaken and a dangerous path. And so those militants, of course, who want to, punish Russia for actions in Ukraine and develop and intensify sanctions and a whole neo-containment regime, that these people are, the whole thinking is an Atlanticist thinking. And I'm challenging it by saying that we need a new continentalist thinking. And I've been arguing this. I know that the Russian International Affairs Council is a partner in a research project in the Greater Europe idea. The Institute of Europe is. We've been doing it at the University of Kent. We've all been working to say, how do we then revive the European Union, not as a narrow element of Atlanticism, but to establish it and give it a genuine continental vision so that it can fulfill its potential as its ability to transcend the logic of conflict, instead of which the extension of new members, Poland and the Baltic republics in particular, have, in a sense, have only reinforced the logic of potential of conflict rather than transcending it. And this is, of course, a disastrous element. The European Union becomes more and more engaged in geopolitics, even though it's not a geopolitical actor in and of itself. And obviously, therefore, it becomes subsumed into Atlanticism and loses its own meaning and purpose within that framework. Anyway, so that, in short, are some of the ideas and some of the elements I think we could put into the, the way I would like to think about New Atlanticism in its third phase after 2014 and all the dangers and, contradictions which attend that development.
Thank you very much, Richard. And we have Dmitry Suslov here, another participant of our meeting. Dmitry also is a part of Valdai expert team. He's responsible for the program on
global issues, actually, globalization, regionalization, and state of the
global issues. Dmitry, welcome to the club. Richard, thank you very much for your comment, and I give the floor to our participants. Guys, who would like to...
So, if I may actually ask a question to follow up, whether I understand correctly your point. Do you mean, Richard, that the new phase of Atlanticism might be an attempt to come back to the very first one, the initial one, the 1941 version before Yalta, with the idea that security means change nature of opponent regimes? Or it's to too big to say it.
Yeah, I think that the point about NATO is that it's always been a very strange beast because it's not just a military alliance. It is that, of course, but of course, if you look at the NATO Charter and so on, it's got all sorts of the elements of the Atlantic Charter, normative elements embedded in it. So it always had an element of trying to change the societies rather than just simply keeping them, defending, keeping, as I said, the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out, as Lord Ismay put it initially. Yes. That's a very good point, actually. Whether this that Yalta, as it were, as you say, pushed Atlanticism back a little bit, and this was pushed back until 1989. In fact, they were using this conditionally, and in the last 25 years, it didn't quite know which element to play most dominant. So, I think that that's probably a way to say that in a time of increased militarization of politics, in the longer version of the paper, I do talk about this, it's militarization and indeed elements of, I don't want to exaggerate, but elements of the wartime struggle against Nazi Germany, elements of it. And not for a minute, first, do I want to say that Russia today is anything like that, but for some of its enemies, absolutely it is. It is the new enemy. It is not only a threat to security, it is a very threat to those civilizational normative values embedded within Atlanticism. So I would say, unfortunately, there are elements of what you suggest.
And also, I think it's quite as a paradox that this approach, interaction or intertwining between security and democracy, seems to be revived inside the Atlantic community because of Ukrainian crisis and changed attitude towards Russia, while worldwide this approach profoundly failed. And I think on the global arena, we most likely will not see something like we saw in 2000s, for example, with those big military interventions under democratization slogans. And does it mean that Europe again is apart from the global development, or maybe inside the Euro-Atlantic community that will be just an attempt without any success?
At the global level, no, there's very unlikely to be seen those Atlanticist adventures out of region which we saw earlier. But one has to stress that the consequences of those actions are going to play out for, well, we could even say decades. That it's the powerful forces which have been unleashed in the Middle East, in North Africa, all the way over to Afghanistan. It's the consequences of that energy of Atlanticism, which was then directed outwards, while Europe was seemed to be at peace, will be playing out with wars and catastrophe. Within Europe, you're absolutely right, which was this endless talk of the Charter of Paris and so on, we now see was totally nugatory, because, well, we're going to say that within this framework, there was an attempt to find, that Atlanticism, we argued, had done its job, time to, lay down your arms and lay down a military-industrial complex and all the huge security establishments, both in informational security and so on, to demobilize themselves and so on. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. We lacked in Europe a mode of reconciliation. We assumed it would be European Union in part, the wider Europe agenda, which turned out to be a very narrow agenda against the greater Europe is wider. We thought at one moment in time it could be the Council of Europe, where of course Gorbachev gave his speech on the common European home. We thought at one point it could be the Organisation for Security and OSCE, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and indeed we also thought it could be values-based. If Russia was going to become like us, then that would have been the mode of reconciliation. Is that then there's no problem, because But even within that, you see, as we know, Putin was actually negotiating in Brussels, very, very informally at an unofficial level, but this is in the early 2000s, to join NATO. When the United States heard about it, they put a veto on it. But that would have been a mode of reconciliation, if you like. None of these things worked, so we ended up with a stark dividing line between Euro-Atlanticism, of which the European Union, but don't forget that some of the European Union member states, because they still, of course, have a certain autonomy in foreign policy, above all Germany and Italy. I think France is much weaker, the United Kingdom, almost no independent thinking. So Italy, Germany in particular, France to a degree, still have a certain amount of framework in this. And they've now been putting forward a mode of reconciliation, that is, dialogue between Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. That is, an element which could overcome it. But you're absolutely right. This contradictory dialectic that the Atlanticism, which went abroad, and then Ukraine crisis is now bringing it fully back in, this extraordinarily militant Atlanticism against, obviously, then, defensive reactions within Russia, which then, we all know, could escalate into something very bad. At the moment, we hope it won't, but it's got the potential, we all know, to go to the way indeed of 1941, 1945.
Okay.
May I also have a question, specifically how sustainable and for the long is, in your opinion, this new Atlanticism going to be? How long is the cycle, right? Because Atlanticism has been evolving during the recent decades, so how long is this one?
This is the third phase.
Yes, how long is this third phase going to be, specifically given the wider context? Currently huge dynamics, transformative dynamics is going on in Eurasia. We see a consolidation of the Atlantic community, and you're right to argue that this is not only military but also ideological and economic via the TTIP. There is also a very deep and comprehensive dynamic going on in Eurasia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is enlarging and going to include India and Pakistan. Russia and China are looking for ways to merge their two grand projects in Eurasia, so we see a sort of consolidation of Eurasia for the first time in the newest history, actually. How, in your opinion, would the West, the Atlantic community, react to that? Would they sort of wake up and try to accommodate Russia again on some more conciliatory terms, not on the terms of the winner in the Cold War against the loser in the Cold War, or on the contrary, the West would deepen and fasten this divide, this greater divide that is going on in the world between the larger West and the larger non-West, the larger Eurasia?
No, absolutely crucial question. As to your first point about how long it will last, I can only quote Vladimir Ilyich Lenin on this when he was asked about, and I think he's still going, about the Dnieper, and he said, his answer, as you know, was "Nadolgo всерьез, но не навсегда," i.e. for long and serious, but not forever. So I think "Nadolgo всерьез," for a long time seriously, I think Lenin was right.
But NEP was actually very short-lived.
His view that it should be "Nadolgo всерьез."
Crisis of NEP.
Yes, but Stalin emphasized "не навсегда" of it. Yes, and I think we must emphasize again, as you say, your second half of your comment was precisely "not forever," for sure. So in fact, when Tafido spoke, I was going to say that Eurasian Economic Union is, in and of itself, is clearly, it's got its own weaknesses and framework, but the Eurasian Economic Union is one of those elements, because I think that if you look at Putin's Izvestia article of October 2011, which he outlined the new phase of the new Eurasianism, new, not neo or not the Duganite stuff, but just simply what I call a pragmatic Eurasianism. It's a technocratic one, railway links and so on, is a mode of integration between Europe and Asia. It gives, greater strength for all of it, because the astonishing thing, Xi Jinping was here, of course, in Moscow for the 70th anniversary. And he was talking, and the Chinese were saying that it's astonishing fact that today there are only two customs points between Beijing and Brussels. One on the external eastern side of the Eurasian Economic Union, the other one between Belarus and Poland. Absolutely astonishing. I mean, this is an extraordinary potential there. And of course, the Silk Road and One Belt, One Road elements. Greater Asianism, in other words, is a powerful emerging complex. You mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And on a global level, of course, perhaps, okay, at the moment, just the RICS, Russia, India, China, but BRICS more broadly, the two meetings of Shanghai and BRICS, the meeting in Ufa in July. You're absolutely right. So in other words, Atlanticism is not the, as it was in the first phase, of course, after the defeat of Germany, the defeat of Japan. It was the triumph, I mean, US absolute triumph, the first phase, in this limited by Yalta between 1945 and 1989. In the second phase, the world was looking for new patterns. The word at that stage was this ridiculous word called globalization, which it was an ideology. Ideology is, internationalization takes place, technical stuff is developed. But globalization was a world in which Western institutions, as it were, become the major dominant institutions of global governance. And some of the other ones, of course, United Nations, which is given birth by Yalta, of course. And that's why Russia, for Russia, Yalta is a myth, in a good sense. A myth is defined as a moment of freezing time. And Yalta was the peak of Soviet, let's call it, Russian power, and given a veto in UN Security Council and so on. So you're absolutely right. Atlanticism is countered by this. And your final point was, will the West adapt and change its behavior in response to this emerging Asianism, greater Asianism, one belt, one road, the very, very close relations between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, in evidence yet again on the 70th, he had a place of honor and his first lady sitting next to him. So it was very powerful images, one has to say this, in the global, and of course it wasn't accidental. Will the West, in other words, adapt and change its behavior in the face of this enormous challenge to its hegemony and so on? In other words, will it change its behavior in a positive way, which I would say, rather than a negative way? And the answer to that, I think, is absolutely, crucial. I don't have much faith in Western leaders. I think that they've lacked strategic vision, that the leaders, but there are some people, Federica Mogherini, now the head of the European External Action Service, really, she has a larger strategic vision. As you know, she was a former communist in Italy. She, which is always, I mean that positively, and an academic background. And an academic background.
Richard, Lady Ashton had also a left-wing background.
She did.
The campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK.
Not all the left are right.
No. Yes, you're right. It's the academic background that's the most effective way. But she, in other words, I think that she does have an understanding. I don't know what you think about that, but I think that, and the European External Action Service is doing two fundamental reviews. It's reviewing European Union security strategy, which is now over 10 years old. It's also reviewing the Eastern Neighbourhood policy, and we saw it rather weak summit in Riga a few days ago. I'm not giving an answer because I don't know the answer to that. But this is the biggest challenge facing the West. Both, there's a danger, of course, of economic and security marginalization when you have this powerful new bloc emerging. Let's not call it full-scale Soviet Cold War type bloc, but nevertheless, this alignment, this coalescence over the East, and in part a coalescence which is provoked by the Hermeticism and the universalism, as I argue in my paper, of this Atlanticism. So in politics, there's always action and reaction. So will the West change and modify its behavior? Of course, we've got US presidential elections coming up soon in 18 months. Almost any variant will probably be even worse than this present one. The British have just elected David Cameron for 5 years, absolutely no strategic vision whatsoever there. Germany coming up with new elections. So it's, I think that we're seeing this, if you like, a new bipolar type of system will become more consolidated.
In the global scale.
On a global scale.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe just a few words, and to continue what Dima Suslov has already said, because it seems to me that now this, let's name it the third phase of the new Atlanticism, it is not totally connected or centered about military and security issues. And exactly when we are talking about this project of the free trade zone between the United States and the European Union, this famous TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, many people absolutely openly name it as the new economic NATO. And many high-ranked American military started to lobby the American Congress, pushing them into the more active negotiations with the EU to sign this agreement, because they are saying we need them as well as the new tanks and missiles in Europe. So in that sense, if we are talking about the new Atlanticism, first, it might be the securitization of the economic process, and then the economic, not integration or cooperation, based on purely ideological basis, because many people in Germany, many people in Brussels saying that okay, we understand that there will be some economic problems for the EU after signing the free trade zone with the US, because the US companies are more active, because there will be US, let's say, regulation institutions working directly on the EU issues and so on. But we are at the same boat. We are at the same Atlantic or transatlantic company, and we must do it. So this is the idea about that the EU is lacking is its autonomy, not only in the military sphere, military security sphere, because we see now after the Ukrainian crisis all the revival of NATO military planning in Eastern Europe, yeah, and very quiet, very taciturn, let's say, the European Union in that sense. And now we have also the lack of this autonomy for the greater economic project. And this new economic nature, if we took the global perspective, it will be done together with the similar processes in the Pacific Ocean, because the Americans are also there, trying to do reactivate the Trans-Pacific Partnership to formulate the new Trans-Pacific club of nations around the US, or not only economically but also in the security questions. And now when you were talking about continentalism, it is exactly about the Eurasian continentalism, because for the moment I don't see some space for the European continentalism because of this lack of autonomy for the EU, at least from my point of view. And now we have two types of, let's say, in the terms of the classic geopolitics, two terms of the ocean policies or trans-ocean policies, Atlanticism here and trans-Pacificism there, and the continental Eurasian alternative with the enlargement of the Shanghai organization, with all these Russia-China projects. So Silk Road project. So if there will be the next great game, it will be exactly between the Eurasian continentalism and two pro-American oceanism, let's say.
It sounds like revival of geopolitics. And
Exactly,
it's very,
exactly.
very classical.
It sounds like George Orwell's
Oceania,
1984. Oceania, trans. What was that?
Yes. No, absolutely. TTIP, the trade and TTIP partnership, is it's. I mean, there's a lot of things. You're absolutely right. An economic NATO is a powerful way of putting it. Don't forget, though, at the same time, there's a powerful resistance to it. I mean, I've just got an article here that where more and more information is coming out. For example, US lobbying led to EU shelving curbs on dangerous pesticides, endocrines, for example. And the fact is that the European Union was going to ban the use of these pesticides, and the United States stopped it. And also, don't forget, a few weeks ago, the US Congress did not pass the law on fast-tracking TTIP. So its Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is very doubtful whether it will emerge. But you're absolutely right. This is why, against people argue against this new Atlanticism, say, look, this is not going to happen. But the whole point is, we can understand the debate about the TTIP in the framework which you've just given. Even if it develops or not, is not the point. This is the framework, And this is the larger pattern of politics, which is, at the moment, there's so many moving pieces, and that no international system is ever just, completely static. There's all sorts of elements, and also popular resistance. And the European Union, the populations have been very passive, but there are movements. I mean, I'm a member, and I get bombarded in the European Union, stop TTIP, and so on. It's one of the biggest movements of our time. You mentioned CND. There's also the emergence of a Stop the War coalition. It's very tiny. I was complaining just recently, look, in the 50s, 60s, we had CND. In the 70s, 80s, we had END, European Nuclear Disarmament. And look, we've got nothing now. And then they said, don't say that. We've got, in UK, Stop the War coalition. I don't know on the continent what's going on. But the whole issue is to stop the emergence of a consolidation of this dangerous new Atlanticism, which would have the consequences which you mentioned, which would merge a bloc politics. It would undermine this continentalism. And when I use the word continentalism, I'm talking about the from Lisbon to Vladivostok version. But of course, you may say that's rather parochial, because it should be from Lisbon to Beijing and Delhi, to Delhi, and I don't know what else, which is emerging. And ultimately, as a subtext of all of this, what is the role of the United States? Some of you will remember some years ago, Madeleine Albright, which stressed how the United States was the exceptional nation because the United States can see further than any other. And as we know, Putin's op-ed in, I think, what was it, the New York Times?
A lot of proofs since that.
And
a lot of proofs since that.
Proof. It is,
how far they see.
Yes. So this was, this exceptionalism. The ultimate question is, the United States would argue, and against the sort of critique I'm making of this new Atlanticism, they would argue, okay, so what's the alternative? Are you talking about a global anarchy? Well, it's not anarchic now as a result of this hegemonic system. Is it those institutions of global governance which were established after the end of the Second World War, which the United States itself often repudiates when the United Nations doesn't do what it would like to do. So even then, it has used these institutions of global governance partially when it has been to its benefit, and not and not reformed them. For example, the IMF and the voting rights and so on has been at the margins changed, but nothing like what the BRICS countries have been arguing for. So the question then ultimately becomes today: the United States has delivered public goods, you could argue, in terms of global governance, rule of law, international rule of law, and so on. Even today, prompting the arrest of all those FIFA officials in Switzerland, allegedly for corruption in the allocation of the 2018 and 2022 World Soccer Games. But have we reached a tipping point where the United States and its claims to a privileged relationship to the global order as a linchpin of global order, have we reached a moment when its potential, which for good and ill over the last few years has reached a tipping point where we can no longer say the United States is delivering the public goods of world peace and order? Now that's a question which I think ultimately underlies this debate about the new Atlanticism.
Yes, thank you. Richard, we have also several questions from our audience from the internet, and the first question is about the Russian interest in relations with NATO. So, what does Russia, in your view, what does Russia want from NATO? What are the Russian purposes? What is the ideal image and construction of NATO? No NATO. Yeah.
No NATO.
No NATO. But
no. Well, indeed. No. This was exactly in the second phase of Atlanticism from 1989. I think that Europe faced, indeed, Atlantic or European security faced two options. Either abolish NATO, and that was the assumption of, at the moment there's these endless debates. Did NATO promise or not about enlargement? And James Baker...
And you reflected it in your...
Yes, this debate
paper.
is absolutely... Yep. That this was in February 1990. James Baker said not an inch to the east, but of course that was dealing with Germany. And obviously at that stage the Warsaw Pact still existed. And it was just unthinkable for NATO then to become, to move all the way to Russia's borders as it is today. The other option, of course, was for Russia to join it. And as I've said, Putin you can say what you like about him, has the strategic vision and understanding, and his associates at that time, and that was his preferred option. Okay, NATO's here to stay. We complained and criticised its actions in Kosovo and Serbia and so on, but okay, it's here to stay. And this is, if we don't do something, then it is going to lead to such. So, okay, let us join us. It would mean transforming. It'd be a different NATO, another body, but let us join it. Then we would become part of a stakeholder, as the modern language of neoliberalism would put it. A stakeholder in this security system, of this Atlanticism, would be stakeholders.
With a big share, actually.
With a big share. It would mean the United States would have to share hegemony. And as we know, as the Chinese put it so eloquently, that there can only be one tiger on the mountain. And we know which tiger that will be.
One belt, one road, one tiger.
Yes, one belt. But it wouldn't be, there would be an eagle rather than a bear, I think, on that one. Yes. But the point is, and therefore the European Security Atlantic took the worst option of all. That was to enlarge it, bring in the Eastern European countries who were former countries within the Soviet bloc with a vast baggage of revanche, of anger, of unsolved and unresolved contradictions and issues. Many of them very genuine. I mean, there's no question about it. But that's not the way to resolve them, because we know that this sense of victimhood, which was quite genuine, we all know Katyn and so on, but this sense of victimhood is always the seedbed for the next war. That's where, this is why Ukraine in many ways is so explosive and toxic today. This sense of victimhood is absolutely just completely, this is a system based on victimhood, which we know is conflict potential. So instead of which, the West hedged. It did very weak elements in NATO-Russia Council and tragedy, but all of these were just largely symbolic, and every time there was a crisis, they were ignored anyway. So what does Russia want from NATO today? Clearly, there has to be a mode of reconciliation. There has to be some pan-European framework, pan-Eurasian, in fact, pan-global system, which would mean that Russia can maintain its geopolitical identity, its ideological. Okay, Russia's a very pragmatic country and there's no dominant ideology, but it can find its own path to modernity at its own pace, at its own speed, in its own way. And we have to do it because the dangers, the Ukraine crisis, which we've all been predicting, I've been predicting it for years. The 2008 Russo-Georgian War was the first war to stop NATO enlargement. We all said the second one will be Ukraine, and unlikely to be a third one because we won't be here. So it's not just what Russia wants in NATO; it's what we Europeans want in our security and how we want Russia to be part of a inclusive and equitable security order on the European continent, throughout Eurasia, and indeed at the global level. That's what we want.
And let me highlight other questions in brief, in a nutshell. So one question is about let's say the anti-Americanism. So of course there is a new Atlantism, but anti-Americanism is in Europe is also quite strong. So could you please comment on that? And actually there are 3 comments on the same topic, at least 3 of our viewers from the internet comment that Russia has always been an enemy of Russia, and it was NATO has always been an enemy of Russia, and
Russia an enemy of NATO.
And it was created as a foe. And another question, quite interesting in my view. So how to avoid the security dilemma and concentrate resources on global problems. So that's how Mikhail Gorbachev put the question in his new foreign policy thinking. If you recall his Nobel Prize speech. So his idea was to reconcentrate the resources from military affairs to, let's say, global affairs. So these are briefly the questions.
I just say that anti-Americanism is an interesting phenomenon. I remember when I was a student at the LSE, I met an Argentinian student then, and he said, I was, and he was by then about 20 years old. He says, I was 18, that I only then understood that Yankee imperialism was 2 words. I didn't at that stage. I was become so used to it to being only 1 word. So anti-Americanism, if you like, has a long tradition in that it's provoked resistance in Latin America. It's provoked resistance, obviously, in elements of the Second World and Third World. I would slightly frame the issue differently. I mean, we are not. I mean, certainly anti-Americanism is a shallow and pointless exercise. I mean, we can say in ideological sense, yes, of course, we can challenge certain postulates, but anti-Americanism, because we all wish the American people, prosperity and success, and just as I'm sure most American people do the same for Russians and everywhere else. What we have to deal with is a critique of the policies of the American state and of the American elites, and of an irresponsible Congress in which too many of them are concerned with their own local constituencies and have little responsibility and understanding of global politics, and therefore can adopt acts which have hugely negative consequences and so on. So a critique of the United States does not, and I would absolutely decisively say that, mean anti-Americanism, because I mean I spent a lot of time there. There's plenty of, we all know, the activism, the dynamism, the energy of the American people, and many in the elite and so on, and many of those who are very critical of US policies as well. Mm-hmm. So we work with them. So anti-Americanism is that it's sort of, again, it's a dead end, and it's meaningless and such like. No, we work with America, and it's understanding that it's itself working through contradictory social processes. Unfortunately, I'd say there's a degradation of US democracy, a degradation of US policymaking, and that the policymaking process over the last decade or so has been dominated, I'd even go so far as to say hijacked, by a coalition, I'd say an unholy coalition, of neoconservatives plus liberal internationalists of the Wilsonian tradition, which of course Atlanticism began, and so I could talk all about that. And so of interventionists, of regime transformation, of colour revolutions, and so on. Now, and it's not just not effective, it's counterproductive, and it leads to chaos. So that's my comment, and I'm glad that anti-Americanism came up.
May I just maybe intervene here very briefly? Yes, of course, there may be no anti-Americanism, institutional anti-Americanism in Europe among the elites. But what about the people? And among the people, I think we also need to take into account the minorities. I mean, there are many Europeans today who go to fight for ISIS, for instance, and perhaps if we take those radicalized Muslim minorities, there might be anti-Americanism among them.
Yes, that, as you say, I mean, it's a cultural, indeed. They are anti-Western modernity, of course, as well.
Sure.
So we're in the same boat in that way. And of course, I'm afraid Russia is considered a weak link of Western modernity, of course, many of these radical militants. So you guys are going to get anti-Russianism is of a different sort. So that's a different thing. But you're right, that's an interesting point. As for Russia has always been the enemy of NATO, no, I don't agree with that. I've talked a lot and worked with, even NATO General Secretaries, Lord George Robertson, for example, who went, who was very committed to finding what I call this mode of reconciliation with Russia, and certainly did not want to see this dilemma, of Russia being outside. I will say that the next two General Secretaries were far less involved with this, Jan de Groepscheffer and. What's the latest? Rasmussen, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Even though Anders Fogh Rasmussen, when he came into office as General Secretary of NATO, his first speech was about Russia. He understood the need to bring it in. I don't think that NATO is the enemy. Even today, this Atlanticism, as I said, if we could find a mode of reconciling it, it is not necessarily going to be this fundamental contradiction. So, I mean, in other words, NATO, if we could have found, if you like, a grand bargain, some way of bringing it under some bigger overarching concept. But the point is, European Union, we always thought was going to offer that, this vision of continental unity in which NATO then maybe plays its part. But such like today, the logic of those sort of comments is that ultimately the existence of NATO and existence of Russian independence in foreign policy are irreconcilable, and that therefore all we're going to see is an escalation of conflict. I'm afraid that is a possible outcome, and we're seeing it today. However, even looking at it from inside, we know that countries like Germany and Italy understand this perfectly well, and France, and are trying to, to de-escalate, as they say. How to avoid the security, and indeed, Gorbachev exactly was talking about that 25 years ago, and of course today we have the global issues. Indeed, Middle Eastern chaos. We have migration on in great waves lapping at the feet at the borders, and sort of climate change, Arctic management issues, energy issues, climate change, massive, and of course. Development issues. We used to talk about development and progress. Of course, that's still for vast amounts of the world, bringing water, education, and modernity to in a neutral sense. Absolutely, that would be marvelous. Instead of all dealing with those challenges, we're back to where we were all these 50. And indeed, if I was in India and if I was in China, I would just look at the Europeans and say, how can they once again have made a mess of it again? They've totally messed up. Why did we mess up? We messed up in part because we weren't able to, I've always been a Euro-goalist, and to say that Europe should have taken responsibility for its own actions, its own destiny, and its own fate. And we didn't. Instead of which, European Union became wrapped up and lost its identity in this larger Atlantic community. Again, when I say that, I certainly not for a minute wanting to say that that Europe should in any way stand up as an enemy or as a bloc against the United States. We work with our friends, and sometimes the best friend is the one who tells your friend you are wrong and you are making a mistake. And Europe could have done that many times instead of Tony Blair and others becoming even more loyal than the Pope when it came to supporting US irresponsible actions like the invasion of Iraq.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we had a very vibrant discussion, and I'm very grateful for those who watched this webinar and for your questions. We hope to continue this series of discussion devoted to Valdai Papers. And in the mid-June, we are going to host the second meeting. We will provide information about it at our website. And so thank you very much, and I look forward for our future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deterioration